So first and foremost, Rebecca Joy Fletcher. We can applaud after this. Is the Director of Jewish Life at Coastal Roots Farm, a nonprofit Jewish community farm and education center that cultivates healthy, connected communities by integrating sustainable agriculture, food justice, and ancient Jewish wisdom. An ordained synagogue cantor, professional actor, and climate activist, Rebecca started her career as cantor educator in New York City and a creator and performer of original works of Jewish theater. After moving to Chicago, she stepped into the new position of Director of Experimental Jewish Education at the Ark, while also working as a cantor at multiple city stages. In time, Rebecca began working with Climate Change Theater Action and became a certified climate coach. She founded the Fletcher Studio to coach and train individuals as well as organizations in embodied leadership and climate communication. Our next panelist is Rabbi Julie Saxe-Taller, who is the lead organizer for the California Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, RAC California. She supports congregations, social justice teams, and builds the network of congregations who are harnessing a statewide voice for justice as Jews with a focus on combating climate change. Previously, she served as the rabbi of Congregation Shereth Israel in San Francisco from 2004 to 2017. Rabbi Taller is passionate about bringing the spiritual, creative, and justice-seeking elements of Judaism together with real-life problems. And finally, State Senator Ben Allen, who is a courageous individual, and I can go off script and say a lot about him, but in the essence of time, I'm going to stick to his bio. Was first elected in 2014, is now serving his third and final term in the state Senate. Ben, we can talk about what happens next later on, but that's going to be for after this panel. Ben chairs the Senate's Environmental Quality Committee. He is a legislator from the Environmental Caucus, the Legislative Joint Committee on the Arts, and Senate Select Committee on Aerospace and Defense. Previously served as chair of the Jewish Legislative Caucus, Education Committee, and Elections and Constitutional Amendments Committee. He has authored nearly 60 new laws in various areas, from environmental protection to election reform. Cal Matters recently recognized him as one of the legislature's foremost leaders in the field of environmental protection. Prior to his election to the Senate, Ben served as the president of the Santa Monica Malibu Unified School Board District of Education, lecturer at UCLA Law School, go Bruins, and worked as an attorney at the law firms of Bryan Cave and Richardson and Pintel and the nonprofit Spark program. Our panelists this morning. So our discussion this morning is entitled The Jewish Case for Climate Action. So my first question to the three of you is, how would you define climate action and how you approach it as a Jew? Any one of you can start.
Okay, you're all looking at me. Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to jump to a question that you had sent us and connected.
Yes.
So thanks, Joel.
Please.
Which was connecting maybe our own personal story to why we do climate action, and that will connect to what I think about what climate action is. Sometimes when we talk about climate and the need to work on climate issues, I think we're talking about that we're speaking to an audience of people who loves to go camping, right? Because it's all about the outdoors and saving the outdoors. And of course, spending time outdoors is so connected to Jewish life. All of our metaphors are about the outdoors, are about nature. And yes, spending time outdoors connects us to the need to protect the planet. And if we stop there, or even sometimes if we start there, I think we are missing what's happening. Climate change is not just about the outdoors. It is about, there is nothing that it is not about, right? Because it's going to impact every part of our lives, and it already is starting to do that. So climate action means actually engaging honestly that fact that we have no choice. If we don't really pay attention to the science and to the changes that need to happen, we're going to regret it not very much later from now. Not in 20 years we're going to regret it. We are already regretting what we haven't done. So maybe so climate action means paying attention attention and looking at the big changes we need to make. And I don't say that to be overwhelming. I actually say it because I think that we need to focus. And we need to recognize the bigness of what we're facing, and that will help us focus. And in some ways, there are advantages to that. It can bring us together to work on many different issues. And then the personal thing I'll say is, my son is 20, but I think he was about 9 when he started reading the paper, and I started watching his face at the breakfast table when he would read the science news. And I started removing the paper from the breakfast table some days because I couldn't handle his face when he read the science, because he's not an adult and he didn't know how to just move on. And I had to become a climate activist because I could only parent by saying, we're doing something about this. That was the only answer to the look on his face. And I'll let someone else answer.
I love that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, obviously, our tradition teaches us that we have no choice but to engage in the work of healing the world. There can't be a greater task associated with healing our earth than fighting against climate change. We also have, I think one of the most instructive songs from our tradition is Kol Ha'olam Kulo Gesher Tzar Ma'od. Gesher Tzar Ma'od, so the world is a very narrow bridge. V'hayikar
Lo
lefachad klal, right? So the world is a very narrow bridge, but the important thing is to not be afraid. And I think that's such a great metaphor for the fight against climate change. There is a narrow bridge that we have to cross here in order to be successful. We've really narrowed our bridge as a people, as a planet, as a species, and yet we know that there is a path that we must cross, and we need to do it with confidence and with ruach and with open hearts, because we know we have no other choice, and we have to do it together. I mean, when you ask about climate action, what does climate action mean? Obviously, individual choices matter. There's no question about it, and we all have to do more to try to be more aware, lower our carbon footprints as individuals. But more important than anything, we have to act collectively, because this truly is such a collective problem and a collective challenge, and that involves harnessing the power of government and society and business and technology and politics to take action. And I think California is uniquely placed to play an incredibly important role in this effort. We actually have a great deal of political consensus here. We've got the economic strength and the entrepreneurial community that will help to create the new innovative products that are going to end up helping the world address this enormous challenge. And so it's special that you're here and engaging in the political process here, because I think actually this is where America's fight against climate change is happening. Washington is a very important part of this conversation, but I'd say we're just as important because of the division and the dysfunction of Washington, but also because of the consensus and the power of this state. We can act in complementarity with those that want to act in Washington and those that want to act around the world, and we're doing this in so many ways. But ultimately, we have to come up with policies here that aren't just going to lower our contribution to climate change, but that will help to show the way to the rest of the world that there's a way to fight climate change that won't break your economy, and the technological solutions exist. And that's a really important part of our work, and I just encourage you to double down. Take that narrow bridge, don't be afraid, because we have no other choice.
Wonderful.
So I feel like the last piece to this mosaic is that if your faith, your heritage, the people you come from, if all that does not inspire you to, in whatever way you can, be a climate warrior, then your faith is not serving you. And the good news is that it's all over Judaism. The other news is that Judaism is a very, very old religion, and we don't tend to throw anything out. And so different things like old sweaters that you find 20 years later and are like, this is really great. I thought it was really uncool, but now I can make it cool if I cut off this sleeve. Like, that has happened throughout our history. Throughout our history. Which means that the tendency that many of us, myself included until recent years, that many of us, many folks who identify as Jews, that the tendency to assume that caring deeply for the earth, that fighting for our collective connection to and future on this planet, that is not really essentially a Jewish thing. That Jewish farming is really not a Jewish thing, right? That assumption that we're the people of the book, not the people of the land, the people of the book, not the people of the body, the people, like, I love Torah as much as the next person. I ain't saying throw out the Torah, but what I am saying is that there's a Torah that is embedded within Judaism, and I myself am on a journey, and I encourage everyone here to demand of your heritage that it inspire and uplift you, because it can. This is not outside of Judaism. It's just not been the sweater that we happen to pull out in the last couple of 100 years.
Wonderful, thank you. So, Rabbi, you said the word focus, right? We have to focus. And Senator, you are, So I'm prepping the question. You're all going to have a chance to speak. Senator, you are forever memorialized with the plastic ban, in museums and whatnot. And yet I remember every year getting a call from David Bocarsley. Okay, it's not going to pass this year. Okay, we're going to push it to next year. Okay, it's a 2-year bill. Organizing congregations that want to see quick action, and that there's no quick action, they walk away to the next shiny thing, having to, authoring bills and having to shelve them. How do we stay focused? How do we stay in the fight? Because, bills come up and bills go down, but, what do we do for all of you? Please.
First of all, thank you for quoting Rabbi Nachman's song, or which we sing as a song, and not only the bridge, but the ikar, the focus, the principle, that's the main thing. Ikar means the main thing. So to come back to to that focus on the main thing. Yeah. Yes, the essence. Mm-hmm. I'm the organizer for RAC California, which is the Reform Movement's California network of congregations. And if you're a member of a Reformed congregation and you're not yet in touch with us, please come to me. And if you're not, please come connect. But we used to do exactly what you just described, which was pick mainly a bill and work on it, and then it would pass and we would celebrate, or it would fail and we would be sad, and then we would move on to another issue where we were gonna put our passion. And our climate campaign is actually a commitment to a multi-year campaign, because we don't want to fall into that anymore. So we need to stick with something that is not only about one bill, even as we dig in and fight for the passage of a bill.
Wow,
yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all these things, the marathon, not a sprint, is a great metaphor. People overuse it, but it's so true, right? I mean, a marathon involves, you're in the race, you keep running. Sometimes you slow down. You got to pace yourself. You got to make sure that you can maintain your own momentum. But in the end of the day, you have to finish it, and you have to be relentless and gritty and resilient and all the rest. So it's about keeping your eye on the prize and making sure that you don't. That you don't get too overly depressed about the defeats and the microaggressions that you suffer and all the rest, and just keep plowing ahead, because we have to succeed. We have to. It's an existential question. I mean, these environmental questions, and our future generations are relying on us to stick with it.
Love that.
I'm bringing up the spiritual rear here. I know it sounds strange, right? So the word hope, like tikva, which is probably the most direct modern Hebrew translation of hope. Do I feel hopeful? It's a question I hear a lot. do you feel hopeful? No, I don't feel so hopeful. Ugh, I feel hopeless, right, about the climate emergency. The word hope, not such a Jewish word. The word faithfulness, faithful action, emunah, big Jewish word. So I think that in answer to this question, that it's really, really important in fighting the long fight, and this is gonna be a long fight. It's gonna be a fight that actually never ends. It just changes. I think that it's really important to make sure we do not fall into despair. Because despair, as Rabbi Nachman would say, shuts down our imagination and it makes us incapable of action. Overwhelm, there's nothing like overwhelm to keep you from doing anything, right? And I think we all know, and I would say I am one of those every other day, a person who feels so overwhelmed by this emergency that I don't do anything. I meet people like that every day. So how do we combat that? I think that Jewish tradition offers amazing ways, and one of the ways is that it's not actually about feeling hopeful or not. It actually doesn't really matter if you feel hopeful, according to Jewish tradition. The Maimonides, Rambam, great Jewish thinker, medieval Spain, he created principles of faith. The 12th one is, Ani ma'amin b'viat HaMashiach, I believe in the coming of the Messiah. Va'af pi sheyitma'meh, and even though, incidentally, the Messiah seems to be very late, af al pi bechol yom echake lo. Even so, I decide, gosh darn it, that every day I'm going to put on my big girl boots and I'm going to bake some cookies and I'm going to go outside by the gate and I'm going to hold up a big sign and I'm going to say, welcome Messiah. That's literally the principle of faith. It does not say, I believe in the coming of the Messiah. That's about hope. Hope, irrelevant. Action that you may feel great, you may feel hopeless about, but we don't know the end result, so let's put on our big kid boots and go outside and hold up a sign and say, this is what I'm fighting for, though you happen to be really late, Messiah. So what I'm trying to say in essence is that taking care, active care of not getting overwhelmed is a choice we have. And so we must learn to exercise that choice.
Amazing. And I hope that everyone was able to kind of see the thread here, right? That one must stay individually, right, within the fight. One must have that faith. When one organizes thousands and thousands of individuals, to know how to lift them up when there is a loss, and to look to those that are making the power that when they have a loss, what do? They reintroduce the bill in the next session, right? Because there is faith in the coming. Yes?
And I will say, part of why we were able to get the bill done ultimately was because our opponents knew that we weren't going to go away. They figured, you know what, let's just strike a deal with them now, because this thing is just going to drag on forever. And they knew that we were going to keep at it.
That's an amazing nugget of truth there, of when they know that we're going to introduce it the next session, and the next session we're going to keep electing more people and organizing more people. So that being said, right, with every wonderful thing that you just said, it almost at times feels like we're playing whack-a-mole, right? Which bill, which climate crisis bill? How do we fund it, especially coming with what the May revise, might have in store for us? So what is the next big thing that we are working towards, that we have to fund, that we have to pass?
Well, I think first of all, we passed a pretty significant climate package here in Sacramento last year. So part of the challenge involves making sure it's well implemented, making sure we have the resources to build out the infrastructure associated with meeting our climate goals, and that's not going to be easy. I mean, there's passing bills, and then there's actually implementation. There's mitigation as well. How do we get resources out to communities that we know are going to be feeling the impacts of climate change and give them the relief and support that they need? But to decarbonize our economy is going to take a ton of work, and the infrastructurally. I mean, electrifying, building out the grid infrastructure. There's lots of labor concerns that continue to bubble up in very serious ways. So we're going to need, it's all hands on deck here. I mean, including our great logistical and entrepreneurial minds getting involved in creating the new systems and products that are going to help us thread needles and create a deployment of a decarbonized energy sector that's going to help us get quicker to our goals, while we also continue to put the political pressure on. I mean, I think we're at a point now where everybody is forced to reckon with the fact that California is going to take action. And I don't know if those of you who flew in here, I flew in the other day, and you're sort of pummeled with propaganda at the airport, with all these companies and trade associations using all the right language associated with climate. There was actually an ad by a cattle rancher saying, "I'm a climate warrior." Some of it gets a little Orwellian, but it speaks to how much we've changed the conversation here. Obviously, we need to keep that effort up nationally, but I think quite frankly, it really comes down to just continuing to push and continuing to get people elected who actually care about this.
So I want to touch upon what you just said, and before I open it up to the community. Senator, sitting to your left, right, you have two individuals, one involved in statewide organizing, one involved in kind of the individual micro communities. You talked about implementation, and I think it's safe to say that so many of us focus on passage of the bill and then go on to the next bill, and then we end up over years leaving billions on the table and no, I mean, this is the only time we're going to mention the words trickle down, but implementation doesn't happen. We don't understand that something can pass in Sacramento, but if we're not funding it to be implemented in Fresno, then it's just a nice bill. How do we help you and help the state on implementation, especially when we have setups in San Diego, when we have congregations all across the state? How do we kind of use our power so that we're not just flying up to Sacramento, but that we're going to local municipalities?
I'll pass the mic in a second, but I think the good news is there's a lot of great policy that's been passed, and there is some resource, and coming here is important. But the good news is this place may feel very overwhelming, but it's ultimately the local governments that are going to be playing such a critical role in implementation. And so engaging with your local city councils and local chambers of commerce and county supervisors, to make sure that you need to inform yourself about all the programs and funding and mandates that have come from Sacramento or Washington or elsewhere, and then make sure that is pushed in front of the local elected officials, who of course have very difficult agendas and lots of people coming at them from every which way. But it's actually a way, kind of acting locally is very effective, because in the end of the day, the implementation, the nitty gritty here is going to be happening at the local level, and that's where so many of you have deep roots and connections.
Also, I want to just say a quick word about kind of how the worlds of sustainability versus climate activism have changed within the Jewish community. Because, I don't know, 25 years ago, I'm sort of making this up, I can't remember, do you remember when Chazon was started? About 25 years ago? Right, so when which is now the largest faith-based sustainability and climate organization in North America, nonprofit, now renamed Adama. But when they were started, they were squarely about sustainability. They did not talk about climate at all, okay? And when other folks were working, lots of amazing organizations that were working in climate, they were separate. What's happening now is that it's all one conversation. Everybody gets it. That if you're fighting for water on the local level, you are fighting a climate fight. Okay? If you're fighting to pass farm bills locally, you're fighting a climate fight. You're not just fighting for your nice little neighborhood, right? And so I want to say that I think it's important because I think there's still a misconception of like, oh, wait, I'm not really doing climate work because I'm just like, I want clean water in my neighborhood, right? But I also want to make a shout out while I have the mic to for those of you who do not know of it, in addition to RAC, the national, what sees itself, has named itself the National Lobby, Jewish Lobby Against the Climate Emergency, Dayenu. And Dayenu, one of the things that they do that's brilliant is create these local Dayenu circles so that you have your peeps right next to you, and you can decide as a circle if you're fighting on a local level, do you want to fight national, but like what are you doing, right? So for those of you for whom Dayenu is new, my farm is not primarily an advocacy organization, but we work with Dayenu closely. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're looking for a way, in addition to how you spend all your day, to fight with a group of people, that's a great way to go.
Thanks. And we work in partnership with Dayenu, both nationally and statewide as well. I think what I'll add is, well, wow, you brought up so many topics. So the question of after we pass a bill, what about implementation, and what about the even more local? So right, state versus Washington or federal, but also much more local. We need to make the the conversation about climate and what we're doing a central part of Jewish life, and make partnerships right at home in our towns and in our cities. And it will then become clear what kinds of things we can do. So everything that you were just talking about making sure that we don't just pass the law and then turn from it, but we look for where's the funding so that we can access everything that just became possible and don't leave the money on the table. That can be done in synagogues and in JCCs. We can be putting on those programs to make sure that people turn to their Jewish community for, well, what do I do? I read that in the paper. Where do I find out if I could actually access that? Or how could I show up in solidarity with a low-income community that needs to know and is organizing themselves? It's not that we need to do it for them, but how can we show up in partnership with them? So, for example, there are numerous coalitions of organizations working on climate justice across California. One of them is the California Green New Deal Coalition, and we've been partnering with them and had them on a webinar a couple weeks ago. A woman came and taught us about community resilience centers. The idea is you don't create a new center, you don't build a new building, you create a community resilience center at a synagogue or a library or a church, and you invest in programs that will help people build relationships, and you add resources so that there can be not only solar panels but getting off the grid, so that if the grid goes down, you could come in and get air conditioning if it's too hot, or heat if it's too cold, etc. So all the kinds of things we need to do, we can do at the local level, and that doesn't only mean the city, it could also mean your synagogue or your JCC or your local library.
Amazing. So before I open it up to one or two questions before we wrap up at 10:30, I just want to take a moment and just celebrate and recognize the beauty of information that we are receiving. Not only information that we can take with us when we go across the street in a few minutes or in a few hours to the state capitol, but information that we can take with us back to our home communities. And that really is how we really work together to solve this crisis. So I wanted to open it up if there's one or two questions, not statements, but questions, to ask our wonderful panel. Yes.
I think thank you for that question. That is a really good question because it's right on a place where we need to make change. It's right on, okay, you have people in mind when you ask that question. You want to know what to say to go back to the people you have in mind. And I honestly think that the most persuasive way to help somebody see something that they haven't seen yet is to hear a story from a real person. And that can include you sharing a story from someone you've heard it, if there's not a direct connection between who you're talking to and whose story you've heard. So I was recently with a group with Pico, California, and hearing the story of a local organizing fight that took at least 2 years in San Francisco, led by immigrant women, mostly immigrant women in San Francisco, and they went door to door. I don't remember how many hundreds of people they spoke with to get their stories about housing and to find out how housing insecurity was impacting hundreds and hundreds of, thousands of families in San Francisco. And they used those stories to win a passage of a whole new policy putting a tax on vacancies in San Francisco. When they started this campaign, they were told, you will never get a vacancy tax in San Francisco. And it was stories of real people, not dangerous people, right? When you hear that story, you stop thinking dangerous people, and you realize, I want that family to stay in their house, to stay in their apartment.
Wonderful. Another question, please.
Yes, going back to climate action, I love the point that was brought up that the first step is understanding where we are with climate. So there's a lot of changes that have been made recently that we want to do in every day, like looking for straws and reducing single-use items that we have. I also love the beautiful point brought up that we have the choice to not be overwhelmed. So how much responsibility do we have to help the environment and climate around us by our day-to-day actions versus also holding accountable some of these larger companies that are responsible for these giant carbon emissions?
Great question. Who wants to take this first?
Yes. No, seriously, I feel like yes. You know, on the beautiful podcast, How to Save a Planet, I wish I could quote the specific person who said this, but I don't remember. But the point was made on a recent podcast. Find the concentric circles of what you love and what the world needs now, and find the place in the middle, right? Like, none of us are going to serve well to do the things that we can't do. We can be uncomfortable. That's great to be uncomfortable. But to do stuff poorly because you are not well suited for that? So how can I tell you where the line is of responsibility, except that you have feet in both places?
Yeah, I mean, obviously both, right? But I will, and no one wants to be a hypocrite. I mean, you don't want to call people out when you're not taking reasonable steps to do the right thing. That being said, we all know that the only way we solve these problems is through addressing the big emitters and the big issues. I mean, you can live the greenest life you could possibly live, and it's not going to make a difference if we don't get those the big players to start to comply. So I would put a lot of focus actually on the kind of the latter activism that you talked about, including making sure that we get elected officials and government agencies working on this too. It's really important to have activists out there calling out the polluters, but at the same time, it's also really important that that the government follow up, because it's government that has the power to really force the issue. And I think what ends up happening is that the big corporations get a lot of influence, and they muddy the waters, and they spin everyone in different directions. And next thing you know, you've been filibustered, and you don't quite know what's happened. And that's where the activists come in, keeping the eyes on the prize, keeping the pressure on on the elected officials. So we need to create more. If you look at the most successful movements, who's able to get their issues to the top? You look at labor, for example. I think the environmental movement can and should learn a lot from the labor movement. Harnessing people power, both with a compelling story, but also some hard edges, some tough engagement, some accountability. A sense that, hey, you can come up here and give a nice speech about environmental issues, but actually no, you weren't there when it came to a critical bill, or an accountability measure. And I think the environmental movement is filled with a lot of nice people who want to do the right thing, but we got to get a little tougher.
Can I add to that?
Please.
I think I've been in a lot of conversations with younger people and people 2 generations older, so the grandparents. And there's a lot of like, oh, we're leaving such a bad mess to the grandchildren. And I think adults need to be actually angry rather than guilty. Sure, we've been living lives that did not fix the problem, but I don't think anyone in this room is responsible for the big decisions that we are living with now. And feeling guilty and focusing a lot on the little things is not going to take us where we're going to go, as you were just saying. And we need to get really angry, and we need to talk about specific things so that we can help other people feel angry on our own behalf. So, for example, you may know that last summer, the governor helped get a bill passed that had been fought for 10 years by organizers around over ending neighborhood drilling. So if you've been following this, it's been going on for a long time. And as soon as the bill was passed, the oil and gas industry, put a ballot measure out, started collecting signatures to put a ballot measure on the ballot for 2024. And if you read about this, you know that they had paid petition getters who were lying to folks and telling them that if you sign this petition, you can stop neighborhood drilling, which is the inverse of what they're trying to do. And we need to be talking about this now so that when we get to the ballot measure, people don't get confused by the argument that's going to be out there. Millions of dollars are already being spent to overturn a law that was fought for a long time. We should be angry.
Love it. Saw a question over here.
Yes. Many would argue that risk and value drivers are changing faster than they ever have. And that has an influence on decision making for leaders of movements like you. And my question is whether you are, how you are evaluating options given those changes. I come from a finance background, and I know one of the largest Canadian pension funds using scenario analysis to help guide their decision making, not expecting the right answer about the future to be presented, but at least to give them a better menu of what is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working in this space a little bit. We got a bill done a couple of years ago requiring the big pension funds to at least incorporate a climate risk analysis into their decision-making processes when they're, because you're absolutely right, there's a lot of challenge associated with stranded assets, and so you can't just rely on historical trends and norms to make future decisions because of how fast things are changing in the climate space. So that's one example. But I think in the end of the day, it's really about making sure that our decision makers are taking all these issues into account and just thinking more progressively and proactively about how to mitigate. But we need. Government can be very slow, and everything's always based on what happened yesterday. And I think it's really hard for us institutionally to move with the sort of rapidity that we need to move. And it's part of why, to some extent, a lot of the focus has been on creating goals that then allow the market to move. I mean, our big plastics bill actually was not a top-down. It wasn't. We had goals for recycling and for waste reduction, but we ultimately put industry in the driver's seat to create the innovative products of the future that are gonna meet the goals. Now we're gonna have to we're holding them accountable to these goals, and the same thing goes with climate, right? The Air Board says we got to reduce emissions. We're gonna hold you accountable, industry, but we've got so much entrepreneurial spirit. Really smart, capable people right here in California that they need a little bit of a push, right? And actually, and the younger entrepreneurs whose businesses have been kind of floundering on the sidelines and not given enough attention are actually now getting attention because government's giving a push and creating some mandates, but not being too prescriptive. And that's creating the space for some of this entrepreneurialism that I think is going to help to save us.
I think we have time for one more question. And if, please.
Hi, I'm Rabbi. I work for Foundation Jewish Camp. I'm curious, in addition to sort of proactive work we do around things like reducing plastics and that, where's the conversation on like preserving the spaces, physical Jewish spaces and homes across the state of California when everyone who's at risk and insurers are just constantly pulling out of the market? That's a big issue for camps, and I'm assuming also for synagogues and people's homes.
Yeah, it's an enormous problem. And in fact, when a lot of the camps burned down, our caucus actually got together and got some pretty significant state funding to help get those camps rebuilt, which was really great. But it was an example, I think, of the recognition of the special place that they have. We just did a little webinar with the insurance commissioner because I now represent a lot of the Santa Monica Mountains, and I just gained all this territory in the redistricting, and there's some tough issues up there because people living in the very high fire zones, the insurance industry is pulling out. They don't want to deal with the liability. They're looking at the numbers. It's just overwhelming for them. And how do we strike that balance? Because one of the challenges is if we put too many mandates and we say you have to insure everybody, they end up, is it fair for someone who doesn't live in a very high fire risk zone, who's made the decision to live in the city or somewhere that's less risky, to basically subsidize, and yet we're also telling people that live in these areas that, who have mortgages that require proof of insurance, that they literally have no option. I mean, so this is a really, really tough issue. I mean, the insurance commissioners created a new program that is going to help, and we're now trying to work with the insurance industry to say, look, if people take all sorts of mitigating steps, then they can get. Then we need to make sure they get insurance. If you're doing all the right things to ensure that your house is going to be less likely to burn, home hardening, some brush clearance, all that kind of thing. But the flip side is we also don't want to lead to environmental practices that destroy the beauty of where people are living. I mean, from my perspective, and it gets back to the housing conversation you raised, I just think it's foolhardy for us to be promoting policies that incentivize construction in very high fire risk zones. I think we do need a lot more housing, and it ought to be in transit-rich, job-rich infill places. And actually, there's a very interesting bill that I'm going to have a meeting about soon with that Chris Ward is doing. That's a 68, AB 68. That's actually it's a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy and California YIMBY, who aren't always in coordination. But it basically tries to reset the balance from my perspective. I think some of the housing bills have been too one-size-fits-all in promoting housing everywhere, when I really think we need to be smarter about where we promote housing. We need more housing, but it's foolhardy for us to continue to double down on construction in the very high fire risk zones, because the situation's only going to get worse and worse on the fire side.
Did you want to say a few?
Super exciting. We've been talking to the people who put together that coalition. And just to add that when you're talking to people who care about climate, who might be skittish about the changing zoning laws and having multifamily housing in a previously single-family zone, and at the same time, those people don't want to see us building in places and paying for people, just as you're saying, tell them that story.
So I just wanted, before we wrap up, I just wanted to say how exciting it is that luck would have it, or coincidence would have it, that we ended this session with showing that we can't just operate in a silo. Because as we started out with the environmental conversation, it went into housing, right? We live in an amazing state, and we can't just separate these issues. But before we wrap up, before we end, there's the concept in Judaism of the nechemta, right? That you never just kind of leave something just kind of out there. You want to kind of wrap it up in a bow and give a little bit of hope. So as we see that there are crowds waiting outside of the room, I'm hoping the three of you will give us one sentence of faith, of optimism for the future.
Look at the long, incredible history of the Jewish people. You want hope? Think of all the times when Jews didn't know what the heck was going to happen to them. And we're here. That gives me incredible, endless hope.
Cantor, Cantor, Rabbi, Senator, thank you really for giving us such an amazing opportunity to learn from the state level to the local level to the organizing level. I think we really have our action plan ahead of us. Thank you so much. One more round of applause.
Thanks everyone for coming.